The transatlantic slave trade basically begins in the early 1500s, and initially it's run by the Spanish and the Portuguese, who were the first people to explore the West African coast beginning in the late 1400s. And they begin bringing slaves at the start of the 1500s to their colonies in the New World, and then the other nations all follow suit.
The transatlantic slave trade involved the forced migration of an estimated 11 to 14 million people from the African continent to various points in the Americas. People were purchased from West Africa as well as the hinterlands in Central Africa and as far east as the east coast of the African continent. One of the things that we know is that the process of the transatlantic slave trade rested on the idea of commodification. That is, transforming African captives, transforming people into property. And this process happened through a number of mechanisms. First and foremost, it happened through the inhumane treatment of African captives. As European merchants on the African continent purchased large groups of African men, women, and children from disparate regions, linguistic groups, religious groups, cultural and ethnic groups, there was a process by which people were treated not as people, but as property. So, for example, people were separated from their linguistic groups, separated from friends and relatives, separated from people from similar cultural and regional backgrounds. And this separation of people was intended to create a sense of isolation, a sense of dislocation, and was also created with the intent of preventing rebellion, preventing people from organizing and rising up against European and some African merchants who were trafficking in human captives. African captives who were placed on slaving vessels were often branded, right, with a hot iron brand of the trading company that purchased them. So a way of marking them as property and then identifying them as the property of a particular trading firm.
And they're often chained up, often with like pieces of wood that they'd have their neck chained to and then be connected to another person. And they'd be marched in what's known as a slave coffle to the coast. They get to the coast and they get put in these kind of warehouses for slaves known as slave factories. And these are big slave fortresses or castles, kind of like a prison. And they may hold hundreds of slaves at a time. And then when a slave ship arrives, they are then sold to the captain of the slave ship.
African captives on slave trading vessels were generally held below the deck. We know that they were held in cramped quarters. People were forced to live in their own waste and excrement. People were deprived rations. We know, for example, from the journals of ship's captains and ship's doctors and the crews of slaving vessels that most merchants and ship's captains engaged in a very precise calculus to determine how much food and water was required to sustain a bare minimum of life among African captives. So the voyage known as the Middle Passage, this voyage that enslaved captives were forced to take from the West African coast to points in the Americas, could last anywhere from 6 to 10 weeks, depending on the wind conditions and the currents at sea. During this time, most of the time, people were chained together. People were chained to berths beneath the hold, so in cramped, airless, dark, filthy conditions. The few survivors who wrote narratives, who wrote first-person accounts of their experiences in the Middle Passage, testify to the inhumane and brutal conditions that people endured. They testify to the death at sea. We can estimate that a few million people who were exported from the African continent never made it to the Americas, right? So probably somewhere from 2 to 4 million people died during that voyage. There are accounts from ship's captains of sharks circling and following the slaving vessels, waiting for the bodies of the deceased. Sometimes bodies of living rebels were thrown overseas. So there's a real sense that this was an incredibly traumatic, brutal, and deadly experience for African captives.
Some slaves would try to resist by starving themselves to death, refuse to eat. In those cases, slave traders had special metal devices that they would stick into their mouths and then open up these prongs so they could force feed them by holding their mouths open. Of course, other slaves openly rebelled. They estimate that about 1 out of every 10 slave ships had some sort of violent revolt, usually not a large-scale revolt, but at least some sort of physical violence.
When slaving vessels arrived in the Americas, their first port of entry was usually in the West Indies, in places like Jamaica and Barbados. And from there, captives would be sold to other merchants as well as to West Indian slaveholders, who then sold those captives to North American slaveholders.
Ultimately, the domestic slave trade within the United States becomes kind of another form of the Middle Passage. And so this is when slaves in places like Virginia, where they have a surplus of labor, are being sold further south to places like Louisiana, where there's a huge demand for labor because of the cotton and the sugar and the very profitable crops that they're growing there. And sometimes these slaves are being marched overland, again in these coffles, kind of chained together. Other times they're put on ships and will kind of sail around the coast, sailing around Florida to New Orleans. And New Orleans becomes this kind of hub of the domestic slave trade, and they're then kind of dispersed throughout the Cotton South.